Michael Morrow, pastor of the Union Baptist Church in Marion, Kentucky. Glad to have you with us today. I hope the study in the book of Romans will be a blessing to you. We're going to continue our introduction to the book of Romans because I think it's important for us to really understand the background before we get into the text of the book. The greatest scandal in the New Testament was the life and the death and the resurrection of Jesus Christ. The second most scandalous thing that happened in that New Testament era was that the chief persecutor of the church, Saul of Tarsus, was suddenly converted to Jesus Christ and became a missionary, not just to Jews, but also to Gentiles, to all kinds of men. Everywhere he went, he proclaimed that Jesus Christ was the Savior from sin. And he proclaimed that not just to Jews, but to Gentiles alike. The book of Romans is not just a presentation of the gospel. It is that. But it is also a defense that the Apostle Paul puts forth concerning his preaching of this gospel to the Gentile nations. You remember in Acts chapter 13, the Apostle Paul is set aside. He and Barnabas are set aside to take the gospel away from Antioch and to other places in that Roman world. And as they went, many Gentiles were converted. And he understood, he already knew that his ministry, to a large part, was going to be to Gentiles. God had called him to that when the Lord appeared to him and revealed the gospel to him. The Apostle Paul knew that his ministry was going to be to Gentiles. He calls himself the apostle to the Gentiles. And these Roman Christians probably formed out of a split Jewish synagogue where the gospel had been preached, and some of them said that's heresy, and some of them said that's the truth. We want to learn about this Christ who's come to save men from their sins. The Church of Rome was probably formed out of that kind of context. Most of the New Testament churches were formed right out of Judaism into what we would call the New Testament context. And so we're going to look at Romans from that perspective, rather than just thinking about it as Paul's doctrinal treatise, as Paul's presentation of his gospel. It's also a defense of him preaching the gospel to all the world. We're going to start with an outline of the book of Romans, and then later, as we're able, we'll get into the text and teach through the text. So let's begin our study of the book of Romans. I want to begin with an outline of the book itself. And I'll tell you that Romans chapter 1, and beginning in verse 1, going through verse 15, is Paul's introduction of his letter to the Roman church. He gives a personal introduction in verses 1 through 7, and then he gives more or less of a general introduction in verses 8 through 15. Beginning in verse 14 of chapter 1, the apostle begins to discuss why do men need salvation. And he goes very thoroughly into that through chapter 3 and verse number 19. And then he gives a section there, beginning in 3:20 and going all the way through chapter number 8 and verse 39, on how God provides salvation. Men need salvation, so how does God provide salvation? And of course, as we look at these things, we're going to define what salvation is, and in that first part, particularly why men need salvation, and in the second part, how God provides salvation. And then there's a question that rages in that New Testament era, especially as Paul begins to preach the gospel as it's been revealed to him by the Lord, that Gentiles are to be included. And so Paul answers that question in chapters 9 through 11. The question actually is, what about God's promises to national Israel? If you think about that just for a minute, you can understand that that would be a valid question coming from a Jewish person with a Jewish background who had taken literally the promises of God to Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, and now they find themselves under the heel of Rome, not free people any longer, but subject to the Roman Empire. And so Paul is saying that this gospel goes not to Jews only, but also to Gentiles. And their question, and a valid question, is, what about God's promises to national Israel? Are they null and void? Has God done away with those promises? Or more closely to the truth of what's being asked, Paul, are you saying that God is not keeping his promises to Israel? And then the last part of it is actually, what does salvation look like? You'll remember in chapter number 12, he begins, I beseech you therefore, brethren, by the mercies of God, that you present your bodies a living sacrifice, which is holy and acceptable unto God, and it's your reasonable service to do this. And then verse number 2 tells us not to be conformed to the world, but to be transformed. And he's talking there about the image of Christ, be transformed by the renewing of our minds. And so these are the sections. When you come to the very last chapter, you have Paul's conclusion. There he gives personal greetings to certain people. He commends the ministry of Phoebe among them as she delivers his letter and possibly other documents. And that comes down to a conclusion to his letter. And we'll get into all of these things more specifically as we go along, but I wanted to give you that overview, and then as we go along we'll refer back to this outline. Well, that's our outline of the book of Romans. I hope that it'll be instructive to us as we go through the book. We'll be referring back to it from time to time. In Romans chapter 1, verses 1 through 7, in our next video we'll be looking at those verses and talking about Paul's formal introduction of himself and his message to the Roman church. Now, Paul already knows many of these people. You can find that out by looking at Romans 16, where he addresses them personally and speaks to them personally. There's even some there that he has worked with in the past, and maybe one that he's actually kin to. And so these are not strangers to him. But he gives this formal introduction in the beginning of Romans, verses 1 through 7, because he wants to give them his credentials, and he wants to give them the authority through which he is giving the message that he's giving. The gospel was entrusted to the Apostle Paul, and he feels a great responsibility to give it as it has been given to him. And so we'll be getting into that as we get into more videos.